introduction, but however, I will go by the manual. So Professor Sachs is a world-renowned professor of economics, leader in sustainable development, senior UN advisor, best-selling author, and syndicated columnist whose monthly newspaper columns appear in more than 100 countries. He's a co-recipient of the 2015 Blue Planet Prize, which is the leading global prize for environmental leadership. He's a member in the Institute of Medicine, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences of the US, of the Harvard Society of Fellows, and he's a fellow of the World Econometric Society. This is amongst many other distinctions. As I said, he's a prolific author. His recent books include To Move the World, GFK's Quest for Peace of 2013, The Age of Sustainable Development 2015, and a very challenging book lately, Building the New American Economy, Smart, Fair, and Sustainable 2017. So Professor Sachs is currently director of the UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network under the auspices of the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, and he serves as the director of the Center for Sustainable Development at Columbia University, and he is university professor at the same university. And prior to joining Columbia in a previous life, Jeff spent over 20 years as a professor at Harvard University, most recently as the Gallant Stone Professor of International Trade. So he has many periods, like Picasso, no? The blue period, the cubic period, the cubist period, and so you're in the latest, no? I mean, so please join me in welcoming Professor Jeffrey Sachs.
Thank you.
Thank you. 20 minutes. So 20 minutes, Jeff. Yep.
Thank you very much. I'm in the period of abstract expressionism now,
Fantastic.
so if I make any sense, then I have failed. But I want to thank our wonderful hosts, CPEC and Kari, not only for the invitation on behalf of all of us, but for the absolutely extraordinary leadership during this year. So can we give them an incredible round of applause, please? The T20 is really remarkable, and it is becoming a global force for good. And I think that the presence here of so many leading organizations around the world speaking a common language about the direction that we need is extraordinary, vital, and increasingly essential in a world where the politicians don't share that language, and where politics is obviously in serious contestation now. That's what I want to talk about, what our role needs to be, not only in this G20, but in the G20s ahead, because what the T20 has evolved into is a very vital force for redirecting our current trajectory. And your voices need to be heard, and our collective voice needs to be heard. If you listen to session after session, there is a common underpinning of direction. I think it's fair to say, I won't put words in your mouth, but I believe that it is fair to say that almost everybody here believes in universal values, believes in rule of law, and believes in sustainable development, meaning a world economy that is not only prosperous, but socially inclusive and environmentally sustainable. I think it's fair to say that just about everybody here would subscribe to the Sustainable Development Goals and Agenda 2030, and would subscribe to the Paris Climate Agreement as two absolutely essential directions for us. Indeed, I would go so far as to say that our challenge that we're discussing is not really the debate about ends, but the discussion of means in an increasingly complicated world. I don't think that the big challenge is that we just don't know in the complexity what to do, or even more importantly, where to go. But we grapple with the question that with a world that is not in the direction of climate safety, with a world that is not in the direction of social inclusion, which in a world which is not on a trajectory to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, what should we do? So I don't believe that our challenge is purpose, direction on the horizon, but I think it is the very practical challenge of a world that is in many ways threatening to spin out of control, and at the least is on a trajectory very different from the one that we would subscribe to as being vital for human well-being, for the vulnerable on the planet, and for the future. The challenge, in other words, is how to redirect processes, systems, resource flows in a direction that we would largely share and subscribe to. The truth is, of course, that every one of the values that I enunciated is under assault right now. The idea of universalism or even multilateralism is under attack. Of course, starting with my own government, the United States, which doesn't accept that principle as a starting point. The idea of a global rule of law is absolutely under attack. Again, I'll cite my own government, but there are others too, which do not believe that one follows the UN Charter or that one's military actions should be dictated by the UN Security Council. The US formal position is, if you don't vote with us, we don't care. We're doing it anyway. I'm not putting words in their mouth, those are their words. This is a direct challenge to the idea of a rule-based system. And the idea of sustainable development is under assault. Again, I can't help referring to my own government, not only because it is my government, but it's also the most powerful country in the world. It is the country that has announced it's pulling out of the Paris Climate Agreement. It is the country that has not ratified a UN treaty in a generation of any significance. It is the country that is the single country to pull out of the JCPOA, the agreement with Iran on nuclear weapons that was then ratified by the UN Security Council, which makes it international law for all 193 UN member states. The idea, therefore, of sustainable development, which I would presume is a universally shared set of values within this room, is not a shared set of values at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. I try not to mention that in the United States, because if they don't hear about it, maybe they won't attack it. But certainly it's not a matter of convincing, because what the Trump administration wants is to dig for coal and frack for gas and oil and maximize carbon emissions. And they're not alone, because many other powerful governments also want more fossil fuels and neglect the implications of that. And then we have the disasters like Hurricane Maria last year, killing 3,000 people at least, and then the president saying he doesn't believe it because the last journal article he ever read was, well, never. So he doesn't understand the research and he doesn't understand the ideas, but he doesn't care. And now we have Hurricane Florence killing dozens. We had a massive typhoon in the Philippines, all of them gravely intensified by human-induced climate change. My guru, Dr. James Hansen, sent an email around this afternoon explaining the climatology of these intense storms on the US seaboard. But this is not the view in the powerful circles. This is what we are grappling with. We're grappling with challenges of power. And we need to face how we're going to address that. I think it's right to say that there have been 3 geopolitical phases since World War II that we should try to understand as we grapple with this challenge of global politics. The first from 1945 to 1989, and since this is such a profound trivialization and simplification, I ask for your forbearance and I ask for your forgiveness in advance. But just to say that during that period, from 1945 to 1989, there were 2 dominant impulses playing simultaneously. One was the US desire to build a multilateral system. And the greatest genius of American political history, Franklin Roosevelt, was the one that got us in that direction with the United Nations and then the family of the UN institutions. And another great American genius and activist, his wife, Eleanor Roosevelt, made it possible to have a universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948. That impulse, which was seen for decades as for the US benefit and for the world benefit, naturally was alongside and often in conflict with US great power politics. Let's face it. The US built a multilateral system and it sometimes denigrated or ignored the US multilateral system. I grew up during the Vietnam War, but during my lifetime, how many dozens of governments have we overthrown? How many bullets have we put through the head of political leaders around the world? How much terrible crisis was caused during that period by the US and in the Cold War by the US counterpart, the Soviet Union, up to 1989. But it was a period where, broadly speaking, at a rhetorical and often a substantive level, the idea of universalism and rule of law were seen by the US as important and worth building, and much was built. Then came 1989 to 1991, and it ushered in a new era. The new era that I hoped for was Mikhail Gorbachev's vision of a common home across Eurasia from Rotterdam to Vladivostok. That was not the vision of the US security state. The vision of the US security state was of a unipolar US world, the global colossus that now was unchallenged by anybody else, who would clean up the remaining Soviet, now Russian allies in Syria, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, and so forth, in Libya. Clean up the mess around, and then the US, maybe it would be a universal state, but it would be a US dominant global society with unipolarity. It was, in many ways, a fantasy world, of course. It was a fantasy world because no country, even a country as powerful as the United States, when it has 4.4% of the world's population, should dream of dictating to the other 95.6% and believing that somehow there's a global consensus around one country's leadership. Of course, there never was. And, of course, no country should neglect the fact that its power in relative terms was certainly diminishing as other countries, and of course, most importantly, China, was rising in power to the point where around 2011, China became, in absolute terms measured in international dollars, the largest single economy in the world, turning out hundreds of thousands of PhDs and rapidly mastering the new technologies. But I would say up until 2016, this 1989 to 2016 strange world was still accompanied once in a while by commitments to multilateralism. President Obama, of course, more than George W. Bush. I wouldn't exaggerate even for President Obama, who launched several major unilateral wars, CIA operations, drone attacks, absolutely outside of the UN framework. But he was a multilateralist on climate change, to be sure, and he was a supporter of the United Nations in broad terms, though often not in practice. Now we have another phase. We don't know how long it will last and what it really represents. We don't know for sure whether it is a deep new path, whether it is a prelude to disaster, which it could be, or whether it is a mere interlude that returns to some vague sense of multilateralism, even though surely a weak one in the US context, and that's Mr. Trump and the idea of America first. I dwell on my country because we cannot talk about any of these issues without understanding the geopolitical context. And the geopolitical context now is that the most powerful country, militarily still, and absolutely still a mega economy and technological power, now explicitly rejects all of the three premises of our meeting. Explicitly rejects universalism, explicitly rejects the rule of law, because it's now the art of the deal. It is not the rule of law. And explicitly rejects sustainable development. We are at a period in history that we have seen before and know that it's a dangerous period. The United States, with its pluses and its profound minuses, was a kind of, in political science speak, hegemonic power for several decades. This is clearly no longer the case. There is no single dominant power right now. There is a very powerful United States cut loose from the moorings of multilateralism. There are powerful other states, notably China, Russia, and of course others that are nuclear states with enormous power, scope, determination of resources, ability to extend military power abroad. And the relations of those states is absolutely up for question right now. When I was a student, the book we read was Charles Kindleberger's famous book about the interwar period, when he noted that the British hegemony had diminished. The US was now the largest economy, but not yet a global leader. And in that context, the chaos of a trade war and a prolonged Great Depression occurred during the 1930s, and then, of course, devolved into World War II in the midst of the ensuing chaos. We are now in such a world, and the G20 represent the 20 largest countries in that world, and the future is now up for grabs. The United States tried to break the G20 consensus on climate, for example, last year in Germany. It did not work. 19 held, 1 broke. So far, so good. But on the other hand, consider climate in this G20, hardly mentioned. Consider many of the other issues in this G20, hardly mentioned Fear of the United States. What will they do? We want Mr. Trump to have a good time in Buenos Aires. There is a lot of consternation right now, as there should be. And many of the other G20 countries have strong national and nationalistic leaders who also, under the spiral of the prisoner's dilemma, believe if they're not playing by international rules, how should I? So remember that multilateralism is not the only stable equilibrium. It's hardly a stable equilibrium. Balance of power, by the way, is also not a stable equilibrium. If history has taught us anything, there is no such thing as the balance of power. There is the contestation of power. There is fear of others, but there's always the chance of an imbalance of power leading to war, either by the one who feels the power waning or the one who feels the power waxing and is afraid that the lead will hold back. And so this is where we are today. And the T20 represents a powerful and crucial voice to say to the world, we are not bereft of a framework and a direction. We are not so befuddled and confused and hopelessly overtaken by technological change or inequality or other challenges that we can't move forward together. Indeed, I would argue that more than ever, especially in a period of multipolarity, the notion of universal, rule-based, and directed cooperation directed towards the three pillars of sustainable development, meaning economic development, social justice, and environmental sustainability, are precisely what we need to keep the world safe. It's hard to imagine, for me, any other way. And we are fortunate for one thing in this very difficult time. Somehow, in the midst of all of this confusion and perpetual wars and rising inequality and runaway climate change, the world was able to reach universal agreements in 2015 on the way forward. That is not a simple matter, and it's not one that will be revisited in our generation. Either these goals stay as our goals and that we work to implement them, or we will have no goals agreed, and we will be in a struggle of power. Have no doubt about it. So I believe that our core commitment should be to the things that we have agreed recently. And we've agreed on them because they are good and they are right. And they commanded a universal assent, albeit universal before the arrival of the present U.S. administration, for a reason. Every government could look at Agenda 2030 and say, you know, that applies to me. Every government could look at the Paris Climate Agreement and say, you know, that makes sense for us collectively. And Mr. Trump's fantasy world, where he said that is unfair to the United States, just proves once again the man does not read, because it is a perfectly symmetrical agreement. It has nothing to do with any particular country being held apart from any other country. So the very idea that this is unfair to the United States is a kind of fantasy But of course, it's not simply fantasy. It is the fact that the Republican Party in the United States is owned and operated by the oil and gas industry. It is corruption. And it is corruption that was whispered to the president, and he said, yes, fine, we will pull out of the Paris Climate Agreement, because that's how our politics works. So I believe that what we need to do as thinking institutions is start from the notion that everything we've discussed today, and I think it's been brilliant discussion, and a very deep discussion, and a very rich discussion, starts with a remarkably shared agenda. Not a confused agenda, but an agenda of purpose, and an agenda that supports the very things that the world has adopted. And that gives us the most important way to cooperate. And I believe our job is, therefore, multiple. First, to remind our governments and our politicians that these goals were adopted for a reason. The reason of human well-being today and in the future. They are temporary occupants of office. Not one of them owns their country. Not one of them owns their politics. They are temporary occupants of office. That's all. They're there to serve the well-being of all of us, not themselves. And so the first thing is they need reminding. And frankly, when the United States says we don't want to talk about X, Y, and Z, it's probably a sign that X, Y, and Z are even more important. And we should not be shy for one moment of talking about climate change and our growing disaster, or talking about the transformations that we need, or the profound inequalities of power and wealth in the world. Second, we need to think very practically and pragmatically together and at the country level, how can these goals be achieved? Not in the sense, especially, of you being amateur politicians. I don't think that's our most interesting job, actually. Our most interesting job is to understand what would it mean, what instruments can we use, how can we move to decarbonization, why should this country not be fracking for gas and oil, why should the United States move to its vast renewable energy resources, and so on. How can we narrow income inequalities given the voluminous evidence of how the fiscal system can be used to reduce income inequalities? We're think tanks. We can think, that's our job. Governments do not think, and clearly they don't think it's their job. And so that, I think, is a second very important role for us, is to be specific and targeted. And we know that there are vital areas that we have discussed, sustainable agriculture. But understand, part of our job is to understand the real power, the real interests, and the real corruption. Tax reform, absolutely essential as one of the key issues that we must take on, because the amount of tax corruption is simply staggering. How else did $30 trillion end up in tax havens? And whose tax havens are those? Those are the United States and UK, first and foremost. They made these tax havens as a game for their wealthy. So as think tanks, we have to discuss dispassionately what's really going on here. By the way, you look at the corruption in my country, which is staggering, because we have a real organized crime leader in the White House right now. We do. But I mean it literally, that's for decades. He's worked with hot money for 20 years. And look at Mr. Manafort. Everything is a shell corporation. Everything is a game. These shell corporations are a shame on the G20. They can be closed down. If we don't know beneficial ownership of corporations, we're lost for sure. Let's get real with what's happening. This is a game of the rich, by the rich, and for the rich. And it's impossible to have accountability if you can set up shell corporations, put them in the name of a hairdresser in Kiev, which is the story in the New York Times yesterday, who found out that tens of millions of dollars were flowing through accounts under his name as CEO of a company, of course, that he never heard of, based on identity theft by Mr. Manafort. And that is the president's campaign leader of the United States of America. And by the way, what wasn't said is the United States facilitates shell corporations. And almost all of Mr. Trump's backing for the last 15 years was Russian hot money coming in through shell corporations. We know this. So these are choices that we're making, but we as think tanks need to be clear about what's happening.
Jeff?
And then finally, to end, we need to help the public to understand. This is part of our responsibility. Public outreach and awareness that we have shared global goals, that our problems more than ever are global, that they cannot be solved at local scale. I'm sorry. These are not small is beautiful problems. These are global scale cooperative systems problems. $30 trillion didn't flow to the bank accounts because of local scale, nor did $40 trillion get 40 billion tons, of CO2 get pumped into the atmosphere with small is beautiful. We are talking about global scale systems that need fixing globally. We need to help everybody in the world understand this, and we need to help everybody understand that a central plank, globally agreed, is justice. It's fairness. For the people in the northern England towns emptying out that we heard about in the last session, for the people in the US Midwest, there was no justice from either party. They were left on their own. But sustainable development is not only about the environment and economic development, it is about social justice. Let's work together. This is a remarkable global force now. Again, thank you, Kari and CIPEC, for bringing us together.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Sachs. We have time for a few questions. Is there any question for Professor Sachs? Yes, here. We take 3 questions.
Thanks, Jeff. Extremely provocative, as always. Since you're in Latin America, I have a question in terms of the T20, the G20, and countries working together. Venezuela, what do you think can be done, and what do you think maybe should have been done but hasn't been done, and can be done in the future to prevent further recurrences of that kind of event taking place in other countries?
Most importantly, no external intervention by force, by subterfuge, by plotting. Absolutely none. This has to be worked out within Venezuela. Now, I can tell you, and the United States stay as far away as possible. The U.S. is allergic to regime change. Our most basic failed institution in American history, certainly American modern history, is the CIA. Stay clear of this, absolutely. This is the most important thing. Now, I have to say, by the way, it is not easy to bankrupt Venezuela. I couldn't imagine that the most skilled economists in the world would ever come up with a successful plan to bankrupt Venezuela. So you have to give a lot of credit to Mr. Chavez and to Mr. Maduro. What a disaster. What profound mismanagement what recklessness. And I met Mr. Chavez almost the first day of office, and I explained to him one thing: don't leave your currency overvalued. Don't think that it's forever, your oil reserves. Diversify your economy, create new exports. I went home and I watched over the next 15 years how he did 100% the opposite. And then Maduro is simply bearing down violently to hold on to this. So this is ugly. It is a unbelievable phenomenon, and it's got to be sorted out internally. This is the only principle that I would say. And when there is internal peace and solution, and it's got to be sorted out peacefully. And when there is that possibility, then the neighborhood can help, because the financial crisis is profound. The hyperinflation will be one of the highest in the history of the world, and Venezuela will need help after its self-destruction. But they will have to come with a society that is ready for help from outside. When that happens, we really ought to help.
We have time for the last question. Last question from the audience. Yes, here. Here.
Former foreign minister from Germany, Joschka Fischer, has said, he's not sure whether we're going to a duopoly or to a change of guard, with China taking over from the United States. What's your point of view on that?
We will not have a new global hegemon. This will not be the history of the British Empire, the American Empire, now the Chinese Empire. It doesn't add up in any manner. We will be in a multipolar world that is either sustainable or facing disaster, but not a new world hegemon. And the reason is that the arithmetic, the demographic arithmetic and the economic arithmetic and the technological arithmetic. We are in a multipolar world. I pray for Europe to hold together, despite Mr. Bannon and Mr. Trump playing games, because we need a strong European Union. The United States, I hope we have a North American free trade area still, rather than the nonsense that has been going on. I hope we have a strong South Asia, because India will be the largest, most populous country in the world. It will be a rapidly growing economy with great capacity, and it should make peace with Pakistan and Bangladesh and make a South Asia that can work together. And I hope we have a strong Northeast Asia, not with an American-led dividing line between Japan and Korea on one side and China on the other, but an integrated region of China, Japan, Korea, as what would be the largest integrated market and technologically the leading center of the world. Actually, if you add up total patenting and total R&D, it would be phenomenal. There's also great complementarity between Japan, Korea, and China economically. And so I hope that good peace in Northeast Asia, led by all of the countries of Northeast Asia, can play a role. But then you have a multipolar world. And of course, Latin America is a strong piece of that, and the African Union should be a strong piece of that. So I believe in a globalization of regions, because the logic of our problems is we need strong regional cooperation within a global framework. All of our watersheds, our riversheds, our renewable energy are at a transnational scale. The United States best not solve its renewable energy problem other than in cooperation also with Mexico and Canada. And in Asia, of course, the Mekong or the Ganges or the Brahmaputra or the other great rivers are flowing through multiple countries. So we cannot do this country by country under any circumstances. And Africa, which has the population of India and China, is 54 polities for one reason only. And that's because in 1885, the Europeans carved it up. But it's 54 countries that are too small to reach the scale. So we need a strong, vibrant African Union as well. So global, but built on regions that are taking practical decisions on energy systems, transport systems, fiber, watershed management, ecosystems, movement of people. And no country will be able to dominate that kind of world. The question, though, is Kissinger might say we should have a 19th century balance of power among those regions. I, unfortunately, in my mind, dwell nothing more than on August 1914 and on the failure of a balance of power. And we cannot afford one more failure in this world. We had two, bloodier than the next one's the end. So we're in a no-error world at the global scale. And that requires us being smart enough to understand we let the genie out of the bag with nuclear weapons. We're in a different world. We can't afford to fail. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Great. Thank you very much for being here today. Let's have a picture.
Good.
Very good.
Many thanks to Jeffrey Sachs
La mano.
and Gerardo Della Paulera for participating today. And thank you, all of you, for participating too. We hope you have enjoyed the first day of the summit. We would like to thank all our speakers, panelists, participants for taking part today. And once again, a big thank you to our sponsors. They are PricewaterhouseCoopers, the Asian Development Bank of Latin America, the German Development Institute, Emerging Market Sustainability Dialogues, the Friedrich Ebert Foundation, the Friedrich Naumann Foundation, the German Corporation for International Cooperation, the International Development Research Center, the Inter-American Development Bank, the Institute for the Integration of Latin America and the Caribbean, Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, the Kiel Institute for the World Economy, the Real Instituto Elcano, the United Nations Development Programme, the Liberal Network for Latin America, the United Nations Industrial Development Organization, the World Bank Group, Accenture, Aerolíneas Argentinas, BBVA francés, Grupo Peñaflor, Pampa Energía, Puente, Quilmes, and Bodega Vistalba. We would also like to thank our supporting partners, the G20 Argentina 2018. To catch up on all the day's events, make sure you have a quick look at our social media at T20 Solutions on Twitter and Facebook, or T20 Argentina on LinkedIn. Tomorrow we will have more sessions, and we'll see you all in the morning for an 8:30 start, or from 7:30 onwards for breakfast. Have a good evening, and please don't forget tomorrow your badges, and don't forget also to return your headphones today. Thank you very much.